about is keyboard shortcuts. The reason I need to talk about that is because there's a lot of shortcuts that might be confusing. You might press a button and something happens on the screen and you're not going to be sure what it is. There's a few shortcuts that I wanted to show that I use. Also, for those who use buttons on your Cintiq or buttons on your Wacom tablet, obviously you can program those buttons to have those shortcuts in. However, I prefer using keyboard for one simple reason. Keyboard has way more buttons that I remember after time. You get used to the shortcuts that you create, and this allows you to avoid going through those menus here and finding exactly what you need. So I use shortcuts for that, and also there are different tablets out there, not only from Wacom. There are different brands that are available as well, and those might not have the buttons that you need. So this will actually allow you to see how to program everything for yourself. So here we go. So let's go, and there's one setting that we need to check real quick, which is when you go to Preferences, and then you go to Performance. You want to make sure that you use Graphics Processor. It also obviously going to depend on the graphics processor you use on your machine. In most cases, majority of the processor will be able to handle those extra enhancements that enabling this function adds, which is, you can actually see here, pixel grids and third eye zooming and stuff like that. So let's press OK. So from here, we're actually going to go to shortcuts. So let's go to Edit, Keyboard Shortcuts. And right here, you want to be setting shortcuts for tools. So it's going to be here in this drop-down menu. Press Tools. I already have some of mine set right here, and I'll exactly tell you which ones they were. And you can, I have my settings right here. So I'm going to go to Photoshop Defaults and press Yes, and save it right here. Save the other settings right there, so we can always go back to them. Just to show you what the default's going to look like. And there's few changes I'm gonna do. So I want to change smudge to R. I want to change sharpen to P, and I want to change blur to N. Those are the shortcuts. Shortcuts I'm using on my keyboard. No particular reason why those are those letters. It's just I've set it up a long time ago for myself, and I found that it's the comfortable way of working. Rotate view tool. I'm gonna make it as H, the same as hand tool. Hand tool, by the way, is also a space bar, so you don't even have to have this enabled. This doesn't have to be a shortcut itself. So we want to make sure we're getting rid of overlapping shortcuts. And I'm not going to use pen tool that often. I rather use P for sharpen tool. So what I want to be doing is I want to just delete those. And all you have to do is just delete, and you can click between. It's going to save, or just press accept. And that way we have, you can see, you get a brackets, Photoshop modified. We actually can leave it like this because this is only the amount of changes I'll ever do, and I'll just press OK. So now when you quit Photoshop and open it again, those shortcuts should be saved, unless you're gonna get a crash that might need you to actually go back and do those changes. So this is pretty much about shortcuts. There's nothing else that has to be said here. Maybe a last thing I will do, actually go back to shortcuts and show you what else you can do. You can go to application menus. So all the application menus that you see here, they're expandable. Right now they are grayed out because we're using this dialog here. What I want to do is actually set up a few more before we finish this lesson. So I want to make sure that match color, and I'll just search it right here. It should be right here somewhere. The match color option, I want to have it set to be Control M. And it's gonna say, I already used that shortcut for adjustment curves. I don't need to be, I'm barely ever using curves, but I also can get them right here. Right now I cannot click them because of this dialog. But I do use match color very often, and this is the shortcut I found that works for me really well. It can be something else for you, obviously, so if you don't want to use that shortcut, you can always set something else. Resize image, I much more prefer Control-Shift-R, R for resizing. I don't know, it kind of works. I don't use lens changes, so if we go here to filters, it was lens correction for Control-Shift-R. I never use it, so I don't need the shortcut for it. So, and then few more that I always use, which is flip canvas horizontally and flip canvas vertically. So I want to click here. I'm going to use Control-Alt-U for horizontal flip, and then Control-Alt-A, which says select all layers. I barely ever use that too, so that's fine. Press accept. And then image rotation clockwise and counterclockwise. For clockwise, I like to use Control-Shift-Alt-Q. And for counterclockwise, Control-Shift-Alt and A. Again, filter adaptive wide angle. I never use that, so that's okay. And that's more or less the settings that I will use. Let me see what's the brightness and contrast. I never use that anymore. I always rely on levels. And that pretty much a summary of majority of the shortcuts I would ever use. If I ever stumble upon something that I'm missing from the shortcuts that I remember I was using, I can always go back to that menu and add it here. It's very simple to do, and once you press OK, it's going to be saved in your workspace profile. And that's pretty much a summary of the keyboard shortcuts. Brush settings, brushes and brush settings. In order to use brushes, you have to press this icon right here in Tools section, or press B, which would be the brush button, and then you can use brushes. There's two colors, or the main color for brushes here is going to be this color right here, in this little bracket right here. It's going to indicate what's your main color and what's your background color. It's important to remember those two, main, the foreground, and the background, because they also have a use for fills and other stuff when it comes to gradients and whatnot. You can actually change them by pressing this little arrows icon right here. It's going to flip between, or you can press X on your keyboard to actually do those changes. So right now we have either black or white, and if you press this little square, you're gonna get this dialog for changing colors, and you can pick whatever color you want. But right now I'm just gonna keep it black and white. Don't really matter for me. So in layers section, I'll create new layer right here, this little icon. So I have a new layer, and now I can paint brush right here, and I can disable and enable. And how do I change the setting? Because right now this is a very soft looking brush, right? So what I'm going to do is, and again, in order to delete what I was doing, so I'm painting, Control Z will undo the last action, and then Control Shift and Z will actually, or Control Alt and Z will undo step by step. It's a step undo. And you can also go to history and do those undos right here by pressing each step of a history. All right, so let's press F5. That's going to bring the brushes dialog, and you see a lot of options here. Also, when you right click, you're gonna see your standard set of brushes right here. And maybe let's start with that. So right now you just see icons. Those icons that actually represent a specific brush or different sort of brush stroke look, those are the standard brushes. And also those icons that actually represent like a little icon that shows a little brush like this. That's those are called mixer brushes, right? And mixer brushes have different settings. That's something we're gonna discuss separately in different lessons. So right now we have the standard brushes, right? So there's few that you can choose from. You can actually use those mixer brushes as a standard brushes too. They have different settings, but they are very useful too. However, for the lessons that we're gonna do, we're not gonna use those. We're gonna use a very limited very limited set of brushes that I've set up for this lesson. Unless you're professional enough and you've been working in the industry for a long time, you can obviously use whatever brushes you want. However, to help you to go with those lessons step by step, I want to limit the amount of brushes that you want to use. So again, we can go back here to history and undo all of those paint strokes that we did. All right, so right click gives us that window. Now, this can be confusing because as you see, those 4 brushes are looking exactly the same, but they have a different behavior. So this one looks like this, and this one looks like this, and this one looks like this, right? Totally different brushes, and they just behave differently. So in order to change that, in order to give more clarity to this window, what we're gonna do is gonna click this little gear icon right here and go to stroke thumbnails. And that way, now you can see actually how the brush stroke is gonna look like. It's not gonna be 100% accurate because right now you can see that, for instance, this one, it's picking, not only picking the foreground, but also the background color when we paint, right? And depending on how much of the pen pressure you're adding, it's gonna change the color that it's using. So that's something to remember. It's not gonna be 100% accurate, but it will give you an idea exactly what those brushes do. And you can resize. I usually like to work this way. I'm gonna resize it to the maximum possible size, like this, so I can see all the brushes. And whenever I right click on the canvas, it's gonna bring that whole dialog, and I'm gonna have access to all the brushes. But since we're gonna use only 5 brushes in the beginning, that's not going to be necessarily that big. So right now we can just scale it back down like this. Okay, so what brushes we'll be using? Let's press the gear icon, and what I would like you to do to go here, replace brushes, and then use lesson 1 brushes from the project files. And you can just browse through your browser right here and have it loaded up. All right, so as you see, we have 1, 2, 3, actually 5 brushes, and each of them are doing different things. So I have them selected. Like this is more of a line sort of brush. This is more of a brush that has, like, depending on the pen pressure, is gonna change the opacity. And then I have 3 brushes that are more sort of a natural look, custom brushes that I would like you to use during that class. And then the third one, all right, so we have 3 custom brushes and 2 standard brushes. Now from the settings, whenever you have a standard brush, which is usually the round brush like these, right? Or it could be a square brush, you can change the hardness. So you can change the hardness of the brush. So the way it works is, like, right now, you can see that the edges of the brush are very sharp, but when you change the hardness to, say, 0%, now you can see it's very gradient, like it's very soft. It's almost like an airbrush at this point. And again, we can change the scale or the size of the brush, and it looks like painting with airbrush. Okay. So that's how the hardness works. Obviously, you can change the size. And now let's go to the settings. There's a few settings I wanted to discuss. There's size settings, obviously, will work on the size of the brush. There's also flip X and Y, and those changes will only happen when you use your custom brush. When we flip X, you can see that the brush stroke direction is flipping. So if we do this and then flip Y, you see that changes are not necessarily too big, but if we flip X, you can see that it's a different direction right now, right? And if we see, there we go. This is without the flip, and this is with the flip. It's basically flipping the brush. You can also rotate the brush, so it's gonna change the way it's playing its part. So for instance, you have this interesting brush that has a nice flow to it, but you want to have this brush to be maybe a little thinner and maybe a little squeeze like this, and you can just do those rotations and see what happens, and you see it's a totally different effect. And what I suppose you could do and try around just by painting strokes like that. It's just to get used to the idea of those settings and see what kind of results they are getting you. By default, use the standard settings, because those settings on those brushes will be having the best use for this class. But you can also play around and see what happens, and this will give you like a better understanding and sort of getting used to the idea of those settings being changed. And that's a good thing to know, because sometimes you might have like a very interesting custom brush, but it only works towards one direction, right? And then you want to change the direction, and then it's not necessarily looking that good. So you can change the rotation right here. So that's pretty much about a rotation and flipping. Another thing I wanted to talk about is spacing. Spacing is pretty important. Right now, the way the brush behaves in Photoshop is that it's a collection of each pressed strokes, and the best idea would be to use a standard brush like this. So each time you press, it's gonna be like a little dot, right? And the spacing is basically how spaced out those dots are. So if you do a large spacing like this, you can see you can actually paint with dots. So Photoshop will generally paint with the shape of the brush that you're using, but it will be spaced out. And now, depending on the percentage, you can space it out like this, or you can use anywhere between, let's say 5%, which will look very smooth like this, right? It's almost like indistinguishable because it's so close to each other. Each of those dots are very close to each other and looks like a continuous brush stroke. All right, so those are the major settings. Those are the settings that you're gonna use the most. Then there are shape dynamics. Those basically can change the size jitter, the pen pressure, which basically allows you to create more narrow tips, or maybe the tips are going to be exactly same as the middle of a brush. So those are the settings here. Angle jitter, which is basically jittering of the angle of the brush. So if you go to your custom brush, you can see that angle of a jitter, like jitter angle, will basically start rotating those singular brush strokes that you have on your spacing into a different angle, which will create a totally new and interesting brush by itself. So let's go back and look at more settings here. And obviously you can change whether it's a direction, pen pressure, fade. We'll discuss that later. Scattering, which allows you to actually scatter the brush. So you can change the scattering amount and the scattering itself. And basically what's going to happen is right now, because we're using texture and dual brush, you're not going to see the difference. So let's maybe use our standard round brush for this. Enable scattering, scatter, and you can see what this is going to do to the actual brush and how it's going to behave. You can change the count. You can work this together with spacing and create really interesting results. Okay, so that's scattering. Let's go back to our standard brush again. Texture. Texture is basically going to change how your brush stroke looks like. So maybe let's do the disable transfer, which we'll discuss in a second, and any shape settings, dynamics. And when you zoom in, and maybe let's do it this way. What I'm gonna do is make the brush size really big like this and press it. And you can see there's a texture to it. And that's basically because it's picking up one of those textures that we have here. And those textures, by the way, are going to be included in project files. When you load your brushes, they should be coming with those textures here. So, but if not, you can also use the pattern. Those are called patterns, by the way. And you can use those patterns with this lesson. The way you load them up to your Photoshop would be pressing this gear icon right here and either load patterns or replace patterns. If you already have your own patterns here, you want to use load option. If you don't have any patterns, or there are default patterns, you don't care about them, you can press replace. And it's going to work exactly the same way as you're importing custom brushes. So as you see, this is the texture, and obviously you can change the scale. So let's Control Z to get rid of it. And now you can see this is a different scale. You can change the brightness and change the mode in which it operates. And there are different modes. Each mode will do a different thing. So maybe like if you subtract, it's going to look like that. It's going to be an inversion. So those settings actually give you a lot of options to the actual brush. So let's go back to our standard brushes again. Dual brush, which allows you to combine your primary brush, which is like this one, with another brush. So let's say I want to combine it with one of the custom ones that I have, like maybe this one, right? And all of a sudden you can see it's a totally different, or there's a little edge jittering going on here. So you have to play with size. So maybe if you decrease the size, you can see that the edge of it becomes really jittery, or maybe you want to increase spacing but keep the size. Maybe increase scattering, and all of a sudden you have those interesting results right here. Color dynamics, it's basically when you start using colors, and let's say we're using red and I don't know, blue, for instance, right? So right now, as you paint, it's just one color, but you can do the hue jitter, which will basically, depending on the percentage, change the hue of your painting, and you can start to see it here. If we increase it to a really large number, it almost gives you like rainbow colors. You can also increase the saturation jitter, which will basically change the saturation of that hue that you have selected, or brightness jitter, which basically gonna change the value. And you can combine them together to almost create a rainbow of things. So if we go like really high levels, maybe not so high level in brightness, but let's say we go spacing, and then you're gonna have different colors. So like you can create a rainbow of colors with this. That super easy and super interesting. I rarely use that, but it's good to know that it's in here. Transfer, obviously this is a setting that is used already in one of the brushes, which is basically changing depending on the settings right here. And the most settings you're gonna use is control pen pressure with the minimum and maximum. Minimum of 0, which allows you, based on pen pressure, it's just gonna change the opacity of the brush. So the less pressure you give, the less opaque, and the more pressure you give, the more opaque the brush will be. And some of the brushes that I have actually use that setting a lot. And there's wet edges that allows you to make it look almost like, or sort of mimic the look of, let's add some different colors here. The look of watercolors. So basically it just kind of adds this kind of wetness. It takes away from the general opacity. Even if I'm pressing the full, I'm pressing as much as I can to have full opacity, but it's still not opaque enough. It's almost like a layer of lycra or something like that. And buildup. Buildup is basically, I think those settings are mostly used for mixer brushes. And smoothing, it's basically how smooth or how much anti-aliasing going to happen on the brush itself. It's by default is on. And then project texture, which is basically if you use textures, it's going to project them. If you're not, then it's going to do something different. Again, those settings will be discussed more in details on another occasion. But for now, it's good to know what the options are. As we go, we're going to increase the number of brushes that are going to be included by each lesson. Right now, I just don't want you to get confused, because the idea is to use the least amount of brushes and get used to them and use them wisely and create interesting results, instead of mixing too many brushes and making your paintings look very mushy and strange. The limited amount of brushes will usually create better results than adding too many brushes and making too many different custom brush strokes, which will, in the end, will make, again, can make good results if you're skilled, if you've been working a lot with custom brushes, or it can create a mess. So right now, for now, we're just limiting the amount of brushes, and we're just gonna go with what we have here. One, 0, 2, never happened to name. All right, so finally I want to talk about naming conventions and why they are important. Naming conventions So let's talk about project texture. Usually create better results than good result brushes, and we're just gonna go. Basically are the way to structure your files and versions of your files for client to know what they're searching for. When you work with clients, when you work, whether you work freelance or where you work in the studio environment, when you're working on the video game and whatnot, having a proper name convention usually means a better file sorting, and your art director or your director, creative director, whoever is a person responsible for your work, will be able to find those assets quickly and distribute them where they need to be distributed. There's several types of naming conventions and basically different kinds of structures. The most that I came across is what you see on the screen. So right now, as you see, it's month, day, and then year. Then the type of the thing you're drawing, the name of the thing you're drawing, your initials, the version, and obviously whether it's a PSD or JPEG. Or it could be day, like a day, month, and year, depending whether you're in US or Europe. Again, type, file name, it's pretty much the same. It could also be just the file name and the version and your initials, or anything that is looking very similar to this. For instance, this is the an example of what the file could look like, or what the name of the file could look like. So 010516 stands for January 5th, 2016. EXT stands for exterior. It could be also ENT, which is the interior. ERP, which is for prop. VEH, which is for vehicle. Or CHA, which could be for character. Palace, that would be the name of the place, the exterior of Palace. Version number 1. And then Maciej Kuchara, which is my initials MK. If you're John Smith, it will be JS, right? So this is a very simple construction, and whenever you have this kind of file naming, it's going to be very easy for someone to find this file and know exactly what they're looking at before they open the file. And that's going to be really important for you to use, because it's pretty much a standard when you work in the industry. And once you have it nailed down, and once you name your files that way, you're gonna make everyone else's life much, much easier. So remember, file naming is very important. And same goes to folder structures. You'll want to name your folders in a proper way. Make sure that the files are going in the right folders. In most cases, when you work for a company, you're going to have your own working folder, but you're also going to have work folders for your concepts to go to. When you work for film, you're going to have sort of a mail drop folders. Unless you work inside a studio, then you're going to use a local network with specific folder structure that you will need to follow. Otherwise, nobody will see your work, because nobody will search for it unless you put it in the right place. And obviously, so this is an example of the naming convention. One thing you want to avoid, and I see it happen a lot, and I did it myself many times too, is putting final, because that's arbitrary. Final means you think it's final. It doesn't mean it's final for whoever is your client. Your client will decide where it's this file is final or not, and they're gonna have a specific naming convention once it's approved. Use just versions. Reason I'm adding 0 is that way you can go up to version 99, which will very, very rarely happen. It never happened to me. I don't remember ever going over version 20. Which would be a file that, or different versions of a file that would work forever. But basically 01, 02, 04, 06, 07, those are the versions that you want to work with. And then whenever your client is asking you, hey, I actually need the version 5, then you actually know which version that is. Instead of, hey, I need your version 04 final, really final. because that's already making a mess. So just put numbers, don't put finals or anything like WIP or anything like that. It doesn't really matter. What matters is the file version, whether it's finished or not. That's up to your client to decide. It's not your job to decide whether the file is finished. They will make that decision based on the approval process. So keep the naming convention because it's important. It's making everyone else's life easier, and also keeping your structure very organized. And that way you don't have to think about where was that version I painted before. No, you just have to remember when you painted it. And once you know that, you look at the date, you find the file. So as easy as that. You have the prefix that gives you whether it's interior or exterior. You have the actual file name and the version, and you know who actually made it. So that's as simple and as clear structure as it could be. And this is the structure I've pretty much seen everywhere. So that's why I'm teaching it, and that's the reason why you should follow, because it is the industry standard. All right, so finally I want to talk about naming conventions and why